Shannon Ridgway states that the term rape culture refers to the ingrained cultural practices of our society that excuse or otherwise tolerate sexual violence. It is used to talk about how collectively we think about rape. This can manifest itself in a situation as people ignoring, trivialising, normalising or joking about the subject of rape. Photography is an incredibly influential force in our society and can influence rape culture's prevalence within it. I want to discuss the potential problematic discourse around the representation of women and rape culture through photography. There is a long-standing relationship between commercial photography and sexism, with just two examples shown here. The objectification and humiliation of the woman in the Mr. Legs advert is painfully apparent, with her being treated like a piece of decoration under the submission and will of the man. With the Broomstick Slacks advert, it is conveying a much darker message. The way the men are grabbing at the woman conjures thoughts of non-consent, while the message below, Ring Around Rosie or Carol or Eleanor, suggests that the women you play this game with are so unimportant that it doesn't matter what their name is or that it's even worth learning it, so long as you as the consumer are getting what you want. The way the models are being treated in these adverts reinforces a negative view as how it is deemed acceptable to treat women. And despite the age of these adverts, the same imagery is still appearing in modern day advertisements, with similar, if not more so, sinister undertones. Similar to the 1964 Mr. Legs Slacks advert, the woman in this advertisement is being treated as an object, another piece of furniture, and in the process is being dehumanised. This is not an uncommon act in photography that is used for public platforms. The animal rights group PETA has been widely criticised by feminists and the media for their sexist depictions of women, comparing them to animals and pieces of meat. The female body is being used to make a point, and in doing so they are being degraded less than human. While PETA and Details both have different motives for these adverts, they both play on the notion that women are objects to be used and sexualised as deemed necessary. They are reinforcing the complacency and acceptance of dehumanising imagery that perpetrates rape culture in society. The Dolce & Gabbana advert has strong parallels to the Broomstick Slacks advert of 1967, both containing an obvious sexual element. The body language of this image is what makes this one particularly distressing. The men surrounding the woman are in a dominant poses, with one pinning her to the floor, while the woman's face is turned away from her aggressor, her legs tightly shut, and her hips in a movement not dissimilar to that of an attempt to struggle. This body language gives all the cues of a non-consensual assault. The moment captured in this advert is being sexualised and portrayed as a positive scenario, shown by the fact that this image is intended to make you want to buy a product. And this isn't the only time rape has been used as an aesthetic in commercial photography. This image is from the fashion shoot Wrong Turn by Raj Shetty. While not necessarily dissimilar to the Dolce & Gabbana picture, this more recent ad caused controversy based on the fact that it is inspired by the real event of the gang rape and murder of a young woman on a bus in Delhi in 2012. Raj Shetty has attempted to defend the shoot with multiple different excuses, for instance that he's putting a spotlight on the issues of violence against women, that he's criticising India's caste system, the list goes on. However, the problem with these arguments is that the violence in this photo, like the others shown in this presentation, is sexualised and geared towards the audience as an attractive and positive thing. The men and women in these photographs are the societal concepts of the perfect man and woman, and created to look appealing to the target demographics. Instead of bringing the trauma of violence and rape to light, it is instead reinforcing rape culture in our society by glamorising it. This behaviour does not just have a negative effect on women. The article, What Advertisements Directed Towards Men Are Selling, says that we are regularly bombarded with messages selling the idea that masculinity is violent, physically aggressive and sexually domineering, and that anger and stoic toughness are the only appropriate emotions for men to display. The regular display of photographs of hypermasculinity creates a dangerous link between sex and aggression that is reinforced as positive again and again by the constant streaming of images through mainstream media. The glamorisation of violence and rape isn't the only problem we face in society from advertisements. This advert from Belvedere has instead decided to take route of making a joke out of raping someone, deriving humour from the notion that the victim will attempt to fight back. Unlike the other photographs in this presentation, this image is probably the closest to an accurate portrayal of an attempted rape, the blurriness of the image adding a level of realism to the scenario. The viewer may look at this and laugh at the joke, considering it a harmless piece of fun, but it further normalises and excuses rape in our society, making the subject a punchline, instead of a serious issue that causes significant trauma and harm to survivors. All the advertisements shown in this presentation are not accurate representations of rape. They are sexualised, glamorised, and made humorous with the intention of selling a product. And with the high saturation of advertisements and photographs on public platforms, it is normalising the false representation of what rape is. This photo was widely circulated on social media. It is the unconscious body of the girl who was repeatedly gang raped in Steubenville. The photograph was actually posted by the perpetrators, showing her off in a manner that conjures imagery of how hunters hold their kill, with complete disregard and lack of respect for the victim. You can instantly tell a difference between this photo and the commercial photograph shown in previous slides, because real rape is not an entirely sexual crime, it's a violent one. The victim here has been pixelated by the authorities to protect her, which actually lends to the viewer being aware that this is a real human being who has suffered and needs to be protected because of that. It's not easy as the viewer to separate yourself from the connotations of this photograph, because unlike the advertisements, it is a glimpse into the true horrors of rape. Laurie Penny for the New Statesman called the Steubenville case rape culture's Abu Ghraib moment, saying it is the moment when America and the world are being forced, despite ourselves, to confront the real human horror of rapes and sexual assault that take place in their thousands every day in our communities. She draws further comparisons, explaining, here we have incontrovertible evidence of happy young people not only hurting and humiliating others, but taking pleasure in it, posing with their victims. The Abu Ghraib torture pictures were trophies, the Steubenville rape photos are trophies. They're mementos of what must have felt at the time like everyone was having the sort of fun they would want to remember, the sort of fun they would want to prove to themselves and others later. Despite the accurate comparison being made here between two violent events, this photograph is an incredibly rare thing to see, the only one still to be found online, while the Abu Ghraib photographs are still widely available. Photographs of wars, violence and death are easy to find and are circulated as a way to draw attention to the atrocity of what happened, yet you do not see the same with rape. Ariella Azalea, photography theorist and author of The Civil Contract of Photography, suggests this is because we do not consider rape a violent act, but a sexual one, and the taboo of speaking about it is heavily ingrained in our society. She explains that rape is not a principle devoid of image. The public gauge on the image of rape is what's missing. The reasons usually given for the absence of rape images revolves around saving the victim further humiliation and a concern for the sexual connotation of the image to lead them to be used for pornographic use by disturbed individuals. However, Azalea argues that both assume that it is not a matter of violence employed against an ordinary citizen causing her injury. Both thus make manifest the sexual aspect of rape and the normative system involved in it. Both reasons imply that it is impossible to rid rape of its sexual aspect, and both assume that exhibiting the images intensifies this aspect. The advertisements we are subjected to in everyday society reinforce the sexual aspect of rape while ignoring the violence of the act. With no societal gaze of the actual images of sexual violence, we are receiving a one-sided distortion that reinforces rape culture by normalising and sexualising rape. Azalea describes this societal view as an unwritten prohibition on showing real images of rape while staged rape images are freely shown. This is supported by the few instances of real rape photographs and their invisibility and lack of circulation in the public eye. In 1937, during World War II, Japanese forces moved into the Chinese city Nanking and over the course of 6 weeks murdered half the population and raped anywhere between 30 to 80,000 women and children, killing many of their victims after the act. The soldiers photographed the atrocities they committed, making Nanking one of the rare photographic documentations of rape available to the public. These photographs highlight the violence and dehumanisation victims of rape are subjected to. They are upsetting for the viewer as the graphic nature and knowledge of what they are viewing drastically contrasts what is considered societally acceptable to view in our society in regards to rape. The photographs from Nanking are photographically similar to the images from the concentration camps such as Auschwitz. Yet these images are not circulated or discussed in the general public like the Holocaust photographs, which could be considered to be purely because of the ingrained aversion in our society to discussing rape. Fredrickson argues that we as a society are oversaturated with images of violence and have therefore become desensitised to them. With this in mind, even if we can distinguish rape as a violent crime rather than a sexual one, would it have a negative effect if we push realistic images of rape into the public spotlight? Azalea argues that breaking the taboo on showing images of rape will challenge the clear demarcation between images that are allowed to be shown and those that are not, the line of demarcation that distinguishes rape from the other horrors that afflict humanity and preserves women as an exception to the rule. With the potential discourse that could rise from showing rape photographs, some photographers are considering ways to bring rape forward into public view. Project Unbreakable is a project by photography student Grace Brown, which began back in 2011. She explained in an interview with Huffington Post, "I created Project Unbreakable as a way of spreading awareness to an issue that isn't talked about anywhere near as much as it should be." Since then, the project has gathered noticeable headway, being featured in media outlets such as Glamour, Time and The Guardian. Brown has photographed over 600 survivors, while the addition of an option for survivors to submit their photographs has extended its reach worldwide, with the project's Tumblr having a 3 to 5 month backlog of photo submissions from participants. The photographs are intended to shed light on the trauma victims of sexual abuse face both during and after the crime. The combination of words and photos is what makes the project so powerful. When you use photographs to make it harder for the viewer to disassociate themselves from the subject, it makes it more real and emotive when you can place a person within the context of the experience being described. By letting the subject have control over what they write and how they appear in the photo, you are giving power back to victims who may feel like their power and control was taken from them. While the high proportion of submissions combats the trivialisation of rape that is common within rape culture, the nature of how they are drawing light to the victim's experiences forces a public gaze onto the issue, combating the discourse of real rape images being suppressed while sexualised rape moments are not. It is necessary to bring an accurate representation of rape to the forefront of public view to combat the problematic discourse of rape culture's representation that is consistently reinforced through mainstream advertisements. However, there is a potential problem with oversaturating society with images of the moment of rape, further desensitising the population to a horrific nature of the act. Grace Brown offers a solution to this by creating a platform for survivors to have control over revealing the reality of their experience without taking advantage or increasing the trauma for the victim. While it is not necessarily the only answer, it does begin to address some of the issues discussed while having the positive effect of letting rape survivors be the voice of their own experiences. Does anyone have any questions for Anna?
Which do you think would be more constructive to this concept? Images like the Project Unbreakable, or what you were talking about, we need realistic images of the actual crime. Which do you think would be better at raising awareness of it?
I think when you show realistic images of a moment, they're shocking and they're very upsetting, and so people can go, oh yes, that's really horrific, it's awful, but it's been discussed by Fred Richland, for instance, that when you see these pictures showing up online of things that happened in the war, it actually pushes this idea that I'm seeing it and it's horrific, but then I can't do anything about it. So I might share it and then I feel like I'm doing something without actually having any effect. While Project Unbreakable, it's people doing something instead of just sharing a horrific moment. And what it's doing is it's helped to combat things before maybe they happen. Because it's bringing light to, no, this is rape, this is what happens, this is how it feels to victims, instead of merely photographing things that have already happened, and so you're not stopping the horror from happening. You're just going, oh, this happened, this is awful, but there's nothing I can do about it. So I think that Project Unbreakable is a much better way, and it's less traumatic because it's upsetting to read about what's happened to those people, but you're not being just shocked into inaction through it because it's so horrific that you feel like you can't do anything. You feel like you can do something because these people have got through it and they're talking about it, so you feel like you can talk up with them, and it makes a kind of camaraderie that I think helps. Any other questions? Yeah?
At the beginning of your presentation, you looked at this idea of rape being used in the commercial aspect. Do you have any idea why they decided to do it? Like why they decided to use this concept for the advertisement?
I think that for a long time, especially like 50, 60 years ago, women didn't have the same rights as men, they didn't have votes, and it wasn't until 1991 that it was actually made illegal for husbands to rape their wives. So there's been a lot of improvements in equality as it's gone along, but there's kind of this notion that sex sells that's always been pushed in society, but when you sexualise someone to that degree, you're also dehumanising them because you're just making them sexual beings instead of a person. And then people want to shock, and one of the few things is that I think partly because we've been so desensitised to violence and murder, that actually one of the few things that can make people stop and look is this kind of sexual aspect with violence, because it makes people look, it makes people notice. But the problem is that if you were using a photography project to bring light to rape, you wouldn't be glamorising it, but they're glamorising it and sexualising it as an incredibly positive thing because it's geared to sell a product. And there was actually an instance where there was a photography project where they had models who had makeup to make it look like they had been beaten up, but they were incredibly glamorised, and there was just a tiny little bit of text at the bottom saying "We stand with victims of abuse," but it was so tiny, and you didn't get that impression from it. And so what it just looked like was they were going, these pretty models have some bruises on their face, buy our product, which just makes no sense. Yeah.
In the last artist you showed, there was a picture of a man saying he'd been raped.
Yeah.
And in photography, sexuality in men are very taboo. It's very hard to see it at all. And we're seeing something like that, especially with rape culture, the idea of the men being raped is very non-existent. No one likes to talk about it compared to women. So why do you think in photography and media in general, why do you think it's male rape isn't talked about? Why is it not discussed as much?
I think one of the things is that for a long time it's actually talking about the hypermasculinity in society, is that we push this idea that men have to be stoic and the aggressors while women have to be the submissive. So it's only been in very recent years that we've actually had more men feeling comfortable coming out about being raped. And even if it doesn't happen as much as women, we still have the same problem with them being completely dehumanised as victims and being told that it wasn't real, it didn't really happen because men can't be raped. And so I think one of the problems is that men are always told that they have to be this sexual being who always enjoys sex and always goes after sex. So I think that's one of the reasons why rape around men isn't really talked about, because I mentioned in the slide that about 9,000 men each year is the statistic, which is still a massive number, and it's horrific, but many of them don't come forward because they don't think they'll be believed because of this hypermasculinity which is pushed again and again and again in advertisement and through society, and everyone perpetrates it in our society. That's what rape culture is this perpetration, that people don't even realise it, that they're pushing this idea, these ideals which have just been ingrained in our society from when we were born. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's just not talked about very much, because if you see a sexual being in an advert who's male, it's just assumed that that's because they're the aggressor, they're the one who will always go after sex, while women are the submissive, which is negative for both men and women. If that answers, if that helps. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.